Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're navigating a really sensitive and incredibly complex topic. It's the push for the death penalty for child sexual abuse.
Yeah, it's a debate where these really raw demands for justice are colliding head-on with, established constitutional safeguards.
Exactly. And it raises some truly fundamental questions, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About how we define punishment, how we protect society. It's fascinating. I saw a 2024 Rasmussen Reports poll. It found that 65% of Americans actually believe the death penalty is warranted here.
65%, that's a huge number.
It is. And it's fueling what some people are calling a constitutional crisis. So our mission today is really to unpack the arguments both for and against.
Look at the legal implications, the potential consequences.
Right, using articles, research developments right up to this year, 2025, it really makes you think about, well, retribution deterrence.
And the irreversible risk of error, that's always looming.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's start with the public's cry for justice. That seems to be the foundation here. When you think about the profound horror, the lifelong trauma, psychological scars, stolen innocence, it impacts generations.
Yeah, the moral outrage is palpable. You can understand why people feel so strongly.
We've seen it voiced very clearly. Like back in 2023, Idaho Governor Brad Little called these acts sickening and evil, deserving the ultimate punishment.
And in Florida, wasn't there a state attorney, R.J. Larissa, last year?
Yeah, 2024.
Yeah.
He sought execution for a repeat offender, and his quote was chilling. As long as he breathes, he will harm children.
Wow.
You even see it filter down to places like X, formerly Twitter. A post this year just said, if you rape a kid, you don't deserve to live. Simple.
So that 65% figure, it really reflects something deep-seated, something that cuts across normal political lines.
It seems to. But what's the actual legal strategy then? How do states try to turn that sentiment into law, given the existing rules?
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting legally. States are basically trying to challenge or find ways around the 2008 Supreme Court ruling, Kennedy v. Louisiana.
Right, that's the big one.
That's the big one. It said executing someone for a non-homicide crime was disproportionate, unconstitutional under the Eighth Amendment. So these states now, they're betting on what they call an evolving national consensus. They hope to convince the court that societal views have shifted enough to revisit Kennedy.
How are they doing that specifically? Through new laws.
Exactly. We've seen specific challenges. Florida's 2023 law, the one Governor DeSantis signed, it directly challenges Kennedy. It only requires 8 out of 12 jurors for a death sentence in these cases.
Only 8. Not unanimous.
Not unanimous. And then Tennessee and Idaho followed suit, targeting what they define as heinous child abuse cases. The proponents argue, look, public opinion is strong. The court's makeup is more conservative now than in 2008. Maybe it's time to overturn that decision.
But of course, there's a really powerful case against this too. Serious constitutional ethical concerns.
Absolutely. And opponents aren't disputing the horror of the crime. They share the outrage.
But they're warning about profound risks. Can you just remind us, what was the core reasoning in that Kennedy ruling again? Why is it such a hurdle?
Sure. So Kennedy v. Louisiana was a close one, 5-4. It really hinged on the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Justice Kennedy, writing for the majority, said executing someone when the victim's life wasn't taken fails to meet the standard of proportionality. Retribution is a factor, yes, but the death penalty should be reserved, according to that ruling, for crimes where a life is actually taken.
So it drew a line. Life taken, death penalty possible. Life not taken, death penalty off the table.
Essentially, yes, a bright line. And that's the line states are now trying to argue should be redrawn, perhaps arguing that this specific crime causes a kind of social death or destruction of innocence that is equivalent.
Okay, and then there's the other massive concern, the risk of executing the innocent. That hangs over any death penalty discussion.
It absolutely does, and it should. I mean, the justice system isn't perfect, we know that. The Death Penalty Information Center, they've tracked over 185 death row exonerations since 1973.
Over 185.
Yeah. And in child abuse cases, it gets even more complex. You often rely on, well, testimony from children who've been deeply traumatized.
Which is vital evidence, of course, but
But it can be incredibly difficult to interpret. Trauma affects memory, affects recall. There's just inherently a higher chance of error, even with the best intentions.
are there specific examples of that going wrong?
Oh, yes. The Innocence Project, in a 2025 report, highlighted 3 wrongful convictions right there in Florida, later overturned specifically because the child testimony, under scrutiny, proved unreliable.
3 cases just in Florida.
Yeah. So it really forces you to ask, If we know errors happen, can we ethically risk a punishment you can never, ever undo?
Which brings up the alternative,
Yeah.
life without parole.
Exactly. It achieves the goal of removing offenders from society permanently, protects the public.
But without that irreversible risk. Seems like a practical point.
It is.
Then, you always hear the deterrence argument from proponents. Does the death penalty actually deter these kinds of crimes? What's the evidence say?
Well, the broad evidence on deterrence is, frankly, inconclusive. A major 2020 National Research Council report looked at this extensively and found no reliable proof that the death penalty deters crime more effectively than life imprisonment.
No proof it works better than life.
No conclusive proof? No. But in child abuse cases, it gets even trickier. Remember, something like 80% of perpetrators are known to the victim. Family members, family friends.
Right. That dynamic.
That dynamic is crucial. Could the threat of the death penalty actually discourage reporting? A victim advocate noted this on X recently, basically saying kids might stay silent if reporting means their dad or uncle or whoever could be executed.
That's a chilling thought, a backfire effect.
It is, and there's an even graver warning that some experts and a 2024 criminologist study raise.
Which is?
If you make the penalty for rape the same as the penalty for murder, you might tragically incentivize the perpetrator to kill the victim, to eliminate the only witness.
Oh, wow. So instead of deterring the initial crime, it could escalate the violence.
That's the fear. A devastating unintended consequence that simply isn't there with a life sentence.
So this whole debate, it really feels like a clash between two fundamental American ideas, doesn't it? Moral retribution versus constitutional restraint.
That sums it up perfectly. You have proponents like Idaho Representative Bruce Skog arguing that child sexual abuse is just uniquely evil. It deserves a punishment equal to murder. They often see Kennedy v. Louisiana as, well, a mistake by a court, maybe out of touch with public feeling. They point to that 65% poll number as evidence of a new, evolving standard of decency.
And Florida's law, the one allowing death for sexual battery on kids under 12 with only 8 jurors. That's their test case, right?
That's absolutely the test case. They're actively trying to prove that standard has evolved in 2025.
But opponents push back hard. They say, okay, moral outrage is understandable, it's valid, but it can't just override the Constitution.
Exactly. Their view is the Eighth Amendment exists precisely for moments like this, to put the brakes on public passion, to ensure justice remains measured, not just driven by emotion.
What's their main fear about expansion?
The slippery slope. The American Bar Association warned about this in 2025. If you allow the death penalty for this non-lethal crime, what's next? Terrorism without fatalities. Treason. Where do you draw the line? Their core argument remains. Life without parole accomplishes the main goal, permanent removal from society without the huge ethical risks, the practical problems, the finality of execution.
It's interesting. You mentioned that X poll earlier, but there was another one in 2025 where 58% of users actually opposed the death penalty for child abuse.
Yeah, and the reasons they cited were exactly these concerns. Fear of wrongful convictions, fear of silencing victims. It shows public opinion isn't monolithic once you start digging into the why.
It's complex.
Very complex. And that potential backfire we discussed, that 2024 study finding reporting rates dropped by 12% in states with these laws.
12% drop.
Yeah, possibly because of those family dynamics. And the horrific possibility of incentivizing murder to silence a witness. These are incredibly serious potential downsides. It underscores that justice needs to protect victims without creating, new dangers.
Okay, so given all this push and pull, what's the actual legal situation on the ground now in 2025? Are these laws moving forward in the courts?
They are making progress, yes. Florida's 2023 law was upheld by their state Supreme Court. And as of June this year, it's led to 3 death penalty indictments.
3 already?
Yeah. Idaho's 2023 law allowing execution for lewd conduct with kids under 12 has 1 case pending. Tennessee's 2024 law targets aggravated rape of children, though I think legal challenges have stalled any executions there so far.
So the clear goal is to get a case to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Absolutely. Force a review. They're hoping the current bench, which is significantly different from the 2008 court, will look favorably on overturning Kennedy. Their whole strategy relies on proving that evolving national consensus we talked about, showing society's views have fundamentally shifted.
Right, because the court has used state laws as a benchmark before, hasn't it? Like in Atkins v. Virginia for intellectual disability and Roper v. Missouri for juveniles.
Exactly. In those cases, the court looked at the number of states banning those executions and saw a trend, a consensus. Proponents hope that 65% public support plus these few state laws might be enough this time.
But how many states does it usually take for the court to see a national consensus? Is 5 enough?
That's the critical weakness in their argument right now. Legal scholars generally say you need a much broader consensus. Think more like 30, 34 states moving in one direction. As of 2025, we only have 5 states with active laws like this.
Only 5. That's a long way from 34.
A very long way. Which is why, as that ex post speculated, the Supreme Court might just wait. They might not touch this until, or unless, many more states follow Florida, Idaho, and Tennessee.
So the immediate future is uncertain at the Supreme Court level.
Very much so.
Stepping back from the pure legal fight, this whole thing really goes to the heart of American values, doesn't it? It's about justice, punishment, risk.
It is. And there are practical things, too. We shouldn't forget the cost. The death penalty is incredibly expensive.
More than life imprisonment.
Significantly more. In Florida, for example, figures suggest around $2.3 million per death penalty case versus maybe $1 million for a life imprisonment case. That's taxpayer money.
That's a big difference.
And you also have victim advocates, groups like the National Center for Victims of Crime, urging us to shift the focus.
Toward what?
Towards supporting survivors, more resources for therapy, counseling, legal aid, long-term support. They argue that healing and prevention are just as vital, maybe even more vital in the long run, than focusing solely on the punishment aspect.
That's an important perspective to include.
Yeah.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what does this all mean? Where do we stand? We have this undeniable, visceral public reaction that 65% demanding the ultimate penalty for an unthinkable crime.
Mm-hmm.
And we have states like Florida, Idaho, Tennessee acting on that outrage, passing laws that directly challenge a Supreme Court precedent.
But on the other side, you have these profound concerns. Constitutional limits, the terrible risk of executing the innocent, the possibility that it doesn't deter.
Or worse, that it could inadvertently lead to more violence or silence victims.
Exactly. It's this fundamental clash, the demand for retribution versus the principles of constitutional restraint. And it really defines this moment in 2025.
It feels like more than just a legal fight.
It's deeply moral. It tests the foundations of our justice system.
So, as the nation keeps grappling with what justice even means in these horrific cases, the question we're left with is, well, can we protect children? Can we provide justice for them without sacrificing the very principles that are supposed to define a fair and effective system?
That's the question.
The answer, whatever it ends up being, is going to shape not just our laws, but maybe something deeper, maybe the soul of American justice itself.